I'm going to stop my screen again and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Abbie Grace, New Zealand Maori and Aboriginal Australians learning from Indigenous contributions to astronomy and exploration. I will unpin Natalie and let Abbie share her screen.
Hello, so I have slides and no video, so maybe between the two of us, we've got everything. So thank you for this opportunity to introduce and celebrate New Zealand Māori and Aboriginal Australian contributions to astronomy and space exploration. As is a traditional way to begin in Australia from where I'm speaking, I would like to honour the Indigenous custodians and traditional owners of the various lands from which we are gathering online and their elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to begin by quickly introducing New Zealand Māori and Aboriginal Australians. According to government statistics, there are currently around 800,000 Māori and the same number of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders in New Zealand and Australia. These countries are perhaps best thought of as sister countries, but the journeys of First Nations people of New Zealand and Australia is entirely separate and different. So it's more by convenience than association that I discuss both groups in one talk. The Māori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand enjoy solid political and social power with a long history of redress for early problems brought by white settlement. National language and cultural programs to honour and strengthen their place are directed by both Māori communities and national entities. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, assures absolute sovereignty of Māori people in New Zealand. And while that journey continues, it is normal to find Māori people in leadership and as subject matter experts across fields. As with many Indigenous cultures, New Zealand Māori once navigated by the stars and used them to predict weather and guide food production. Professor Rangi Matamua is a key academic in this area, who you can watch in the series Beyond Matariki. Two others are establishing a Māori astronomy school. New Zealand has its own Society of Māori Astronomy Research and Traditions called SMART. And Dr. Pauline Harris is another academic dedicated to revitalising Māori astronomy and star law and helping ensure traditional astronomical knowledge is not lost. The Tauapata South Māori Land Corporation is working closely with Rocket Lab New Zealand and Mahia to preserve the land and bring cultural values and blessing to the project. Rocket Lab is uniquely placed to send rockets over ocean instead of neighbouring countries, and they've been launching since 2017. So please keep New Zealand and Australia in your minds when thinking about potential collaborations and analogue work, as they're both gateways to desert terrains and Antarctica. Australia has a long history of cooperation with NASA. It's the place that broadcast the first steps on the moon, and it has a long history of deep space observation. Aboriginal Australians have been involved willingly and not, given that they are often custodians of remote land that's great for rocket tests. They identify themselves by the part of the country they belong to, their mob, and their language group. I'm going to come back to this slide shortly. But here's a map of Aboriginal Australian groups to demonstrate that they're not a singular people, but rather each group has its own culture, language, customs, and more. Despite there being hundreds of Aboriginal languages, some common cultural values include valuing and returning to country or the place and people of your origin, caring for your mob, and staying fierce or deadly, as it's called. Associate Professor Dwayne Hamacher has published a lot of academic work on Aboriginal astronomy, and others like astrophysicists and science communicators Kirsten Banks and Carly Noon also promote Aboriginal perspectives, including the use of dark constellations, where dark areas of sky are used to define the constellation rather than the stars. The Square Kilometre Array in Western Australia is formally partnered with Aboriginal Australians who are the traditional owners of the land, which is a well-established practice in Australia. Commercially, the first satellite ground station owned and managed by First Nations Australians became operational last year, assisting with agriculture and bushfires through observation from space. And also in 2020, the Kaniba Community Aboriginal Corporation partnered with Southern Launch to host suborbital rocket launches. The Kaniba test range became Australia's first licensed launch facility for private use in March 2021. Southern Launch communicates continually with the group and is providing opportunities for community members to develop their expertise and career options, while the community provides local knowledge and cultural guides who are paid for their services in an exemplary reciprocal partnership. The last 2 years have seen a number of initiatives designed to bring public attention to traditional First Nations astronomy knowledge from this region. Both countries' space agency logos reflect Indigenous imagery. There's a link here that shows how Aboriginal constellations make up ASA's logo, including Kura the kangaroo, who last year was introduced by an astronaut on the ISS. Recent coin issues and IAU asteroid namings have honoured Aboriginal constellations, and First Nations individuals and groups with recognised astronomical knowledge, including Elder or Uncle Gilla Michael Anderson, who's pictured here. The New Zealand Prime Minister's Science Communications Prize also went to Professor Rangi Mātamua for his work promoting Māori astronomy in 2020. And a new public holiday is beginning in 2022 in New Zealand, celebrating the rising of Matariki, or the Pleiades, that marks the beginning of the Māori New Year. I turned this image of the Earth on its side intentionally to remind us that we're hanging in space with no right way up. And similarly, there is no one right way to explore space and understand it. We do well to value those who hold unique expertise and to embrace and empower people who can provide new perspective on pursuits that represent all of humanity in space. We're planning to take stuff up to the moon very soon and to go in person as early as 2023. So we need to be hearing and valuing the voices of cultural groups who have been focused on sustainability for thousands of years right now. Connecting with Indigenous groups often means going to where they are, taking the time to build trust through relationship, and acknowledging that communal and oral knowledge isn't less true and actually could be more tested and tried than a new publication. People who speak the languages of both modern science and traditional cultural understanding are more, not less, qualified. Also remember that Indigenous children are often protected in the centre of the community, and outsiders should consider approaching their leaders and elders, not just assuming access to the child, particularly in Australia, where for decades lighter-skinned children were actually forcibly removed and became the stolen generations. Something you can learn more about from the film Rabbit Proof Fence, which is based on a true story of 3 young girls who walked 1,600 kilometres, about 1,000 miles, to get back home. This is bravery we can all learn from. I hope this talk has expanded your thinking and given you a good starting point for understanding and valuing the contributions of New Zealand Māori and Aboriginal Australians. In a climate of international cooperation and potentially competition for resources and territory, it's more important than ever that we honour and celebrate the Indigenous cultures of our home countries and beyond. To finish, I've just snuck these 2 images in, and I really hope they don't mind, as a visual reminder of our next generation of Aboriginal astrophysicists, such as Carly Noon and Kirsten Banks. So I just wanted to thank you for your attention and invite any questions.
Thanks, Abbie. That was fantastic. I see there is a comment, I think, related to this one. It says, looking at, resettlement of colonial languages, what is valued right now in space discourse and what isn't, and that's directly related to what you're talking about. How can space be made for alternatives? Where are the space dancers in the plans for moon bases? And I was thinking about that in terms of, we see all these great initiatives that seem to be including Indigenous thoughts and ideas, but how much of that is performative and how much of that is actually changing the way we are going into space and the way we're exploring?
Yeah, and I think those are the questions that we needed to be asking for a while and need to continue to ask. I think in a way that's where we're up to. We've done some really good work around connecting with people and honouring people and hearing what they're doing and researching what they're doing. But if we're not empowering them to actually tell us what they want us to know and to use their language and to give them the opportunity to take the lead and to do things their way, then we're missing out on that opportunity. And one thing I wanted to quickly mention is both cultures have fantastic welcoming ceremonies. And I would loathe to land on the moon and just be welcomed with a handshake and a cold drink. If I could emulate something that really is so much more ceremonial and honouring of the opportunity to be up there, that's something I would really love to be able to take with me or send ahead of me, perhaps.
On to you, Sandlin.
Wonderful. We did have a question from Abbie about whether your slides would be available so people could keep track of the initiatives. And so I'll let you.
Yes, I'm more than happy to make my slides available. I have designed them so that the links for images actually mostly go to articles and stories telling a lot more detail about the issues involved. So I'd actually really appreciate it if people wanted to request the slides, and my email address is there if they want to do that right away.
Perfect. Thank you so much.